History is often shaped by the specific disasters that do not happen. In 2016, fewer than 80,000 combined votes across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin shift in the other direction. Hillary Clinton secures 275 electoral votes and the presidency. This narrow victory does not erase the structural realities of the country. The wage stagnation of the middle class, the instability of the gig economy, and the deep geographic polarization between rural and urban districts remain exactly as they were the day before the election. So if the geographic sorting and economic anxiety are locked in place, we have to look at what actually changes when a different administration takes control of the federal apparatus. The difference is found in the machinery of the state. A different executive branch doesn't provide utopian fixes, but it preserves institutional stability and dictates the baseline tone of democratic governance. In January 2017, the incoming administration inherits a fractured domestic healthcare market, a closing window to address global carbon emissions, and anxious allies questioning American reliability. Addressing healthcare requires passing the American Health Security Act of 2017. The legislation survives the Senate by a single tie-breaking vote, delivering an incomplete but highly impactful expansion of Medicaid to the holdout states that stabilizes rural hospital budgets. On climate, the executive branch bypasses congressional gridlock. The administration immediately reaffirms American participation in the Paris Agreement and uses the $650 billion federal procurement budget to force contractors into green building and zero-emission vehicle standards. Internationally, the State Department approaches the NATO alliance through multilateralism. They secure the 2% GDP defense spending increases from member nations by framing the requirement around shared strategic interests, rather than issuing unilateral threats of withdrawal. This specific type of governance is slow and intensely contested by the political extremes. But this quiet work reinforces the load-bearing walls of the state, preparing those structures for the crises to come. In early 2020, the novel coronavirus emerges in Wuhan, China. The virus crosses borders and begins spreading globally because of its underlying biology, completely independent of American domestic politics. The critical divergence happens in Washington. Because the National Security Council's Pandemic Preparedness Office was never dismantled, a coordinated federal response framework activates in the first weeks of January. This pre-built capacity allows for the early invocation of the Defense Production Act to rapidly manufacture testing supplies. At the podium, consistent public messaging led by scientists treats uncertainty as vital information rather than a political embarrassment, telling the public exactly what is known and what is still missing. This graph tracks the unavoidable reality of the virus. Even with a coordinated response, the climbing curve of COVID-19 fatalities represents immense economic devastation and human suffering. The pandemic is still a massive, undeniable tragedy. But when we add a second line to this graph representing our actual history's death toll, we see the testing gap. Maintaining institutional trust and public health consistency results in hundreds of thousands of preserved lives, visualized here in the physical space between the two curves. A functioning government cannot stop a highly contagious respiratory virus from sweeping the globe. What it can dictate is the magnitude of the devastation by having logistics and supply chains ready to deploy. Systemic racism and the history of police violence are entrenched realities. In the summer of 2020, George Floyd is killed by a Minneapolis police officer, and massive civil rights protests fill American cities, exactly as they did in our timeline. The federal reaction, however, diverges sharply. The Justice Department immediately launches civil rights investigations, and the administration pursues legislative police reform instead of deploying military assets against its citizens. This results in the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. It passes the Senate, establishing a strict federal floor for police conduct, mandating body cameras, and forcing new data collection requirements for use of force incidents. A single law cannot magically erase decades of cultural violence. What it accomplishes is the transformation of raw societal grief into a measurable legal architecture, creating mechanisms for future accountability where none existed before. By November 2020, Hillary Clinton narrowly secures a second term against Republican nominee Marco Rubio. The electorate that returns her to office is exhausted and remains deeply fractured. the new decade brings persistent, unresolved struggles. The Justice Department is tied up in complex tech antitrust suits. Global carbon concentrations continue their upward trajectory, and tribal polarization defines daily civic life. The presidency is not a solution to these vast structural challenges. The executive branch is simply the mechanism that creates the conditions under which a nation can forge its own solutions. Maintaining democratic institutions is tedious, unglamorous work that demands constant compromise. But as this timeline demonstrates, that daily maintenance is the only barrier separating a democracy that is severely tested from a democracy that breaks.